Well, President Obama issued a rare rebuke to the Supreme Court during his State of the Union address last month over its decision in the Citizens United case. The court's landmark ruling allows corporations to spend unlimited amounts of money to elect and defeat candidates.
With all due deference to separation of powers, last week the Supreme Court reversed a century of law that I believe will open the floodgates for special interests, including foreign corporations, to spend without limit in our elections. I don't think American elections should be bankrolled by America's most powerful interests, or worse, by foreign entities. They should be decided by the American people. And I'd urge Democrats and Republicans to pass a bill that helps correct some of these problems.
Well, our next guest believes we have a problem with democracy in this country that reversing this Supreme Court decision alone won't fix. In a cover story for the latest Nation magazine called How to Get Our Democracy Back, Harvard Law School professor Lawrence Lessig warns, quote, Congress is the core of the problem with American democracy today. In a single line, there will be no change until we change Congress. Lessig is the co-founder of the nonprofit Change Congress and the director of the Edmund J. Safra Foundation Center for Ethics at Harvard University. Joining us now from Boston, Massachusetts. We welcome you to Democracy Now!, Professor Lessig. How do you change Congress?
Well, the most important thing to do is to change the economy of influence that Congress lives inside. Right now, members of Congress spend an extraordinary amount of their time worrying not so much about what their constituents want, but about how they can make sure that they raise the money they need either to get back into power themselves or to help their party get back into power. Some estimates between 30% and 70% for members to spend raising money to get back to Congress. So that can't help but create a kind of dependency which conflicts with the dependency our framers intended them to have, meaning a dependency on the people. They have a dependency on the fundraisers. So that's the fundraising Congress that I think we have got to break, if we are going to ever see any reform either from the right or from the left.
Well, Professor Lessig, in your article, you express deep disappointment in the failure during the first year of the Obama administration to bring real change to Washington or even to address this issue of what you call the fundraising Congress. So you say at one point, there is nothing in the current framework of the White House's plans that is anything more than the strategy of a kinder and gentler, although certainly more articulate, George W. Bush, buying reform at whatever price the fundraising Congress demands. Could you expound on that and the disappointment you felt about President Obama, whom you knew and supported throughout the years?
Right. So when Obama was running for president, time after time, he identified the problem with the way Washington works as the reason he was running for president, to take on that problem of changing that system. As he said, if we don't take up the fight, we're never going to get reform that will last and change the kind of problems we've been facing generation after generation. Now, what is that reform? That means changing the way Congress thinks about these problems by changing the economy of influence within which they live. So that would be the support, for example, of a bill which he co-sponsored when he was senator, the Fair Elections Now Act, which would create small dollar contributions, a voluntary opt-in system for small dollar contributions, where no one after that bill would be passed could imagine that the reason Congress was doing what they were doing was because of the money. It might be they're too stupid or they're too liberal or they're too conservative, but not because of the money. And that's the change that's necessary before people will once again have any faith or trust in this institution.
We're talking to Lawrence Lessig, who runs an organization now called Change Congress. Just for a moment, Professor Lessig, your major issue was the Internet. You then moved on to Congress and corruption and how to get our democracy back. Why did you go from there to here?
Well, what I saw in the context of the issues I was working on for more than a decade, issues around intellectual property, was that though more and more people, parents and teachers and people in the creative industries were understanding the issues and making progress and thinking about better solutions, there was no change happening in Congress. And it's not because the arguments were weaker or we weren't actually expressing them well. It was because the economy of influence of Congress was such that they would think only about the side that was supporting them financially, or they only gave access to the side supporting them financially. So it became clear, it's an obvious point, I'm embarrassed it took so long to see it, it became clear that unless we solved that problem, the problem of influence that blocked them from even understanding the other side of the issue, we weren't going to solve the underlying questions or problems that we faced in the context of intellectual property or the internet. Now, you know, those are pretty esoteric questions to most Americans. And the obvious thing that connected and pushed me to do this was recognizing that the same dynamic that was blocking progress in the context of intellectual property or the internet was also blocking progress in the context of global warming, in the context of healthcare, in the context of food safety. And the point is to get people to recognize, to connect the dots, to recognize that it's each of these issues that's being blocked for the same underlying reason. And unless we address the underlying problem, unless we fix this broken institution of Congress, we're not going to make progress on any of those fronts. And so it seemed to me that it was extraordinarily important, not believing that any one person could solve it, but extraordinarily important to begin to push the movement to get this issue solved.
But I guess a key assumption of your analysis is that the Congress is broken compared to a time when it was fixed, or that it's somehow more corrupt now than it was in the past, when some would argue that this has been historically a problem in the United States of those with money being able to buy influence in the halls of Congress and in Washington.
Yeah, it's counterintuitive because on the one hand, I think the amount of overt bribery, violations of criminal law by members of Congress is at the lowest it's ever been in the history of the United States Congress. I mean, the 19th century was a cesspool of that grotesque kind of corruption. And the 20th century and 21st century are obviously much better in that sense. But the kind of corruption that we've got now is not the hidden corruption of people taking brown paper bags of cash. It's a kind of corruption in the open. It's openly encouraging people whose interests you are regulating to contribute in a way to affect that regulation. So it's nobody hides. Max Baucus doesn't hide the fact that he receives more than $4 million in money from the interest whom he controls as the most powerful person in the Senate over health care. He is open about it. And by encouraging this kind of dynamic, this kind of economy, we make it actually much harder for ordinary people to believe that they have some role to play here. And in some sense, even if the souls of members are not more corrupt, even if they're, as I believe they are, more honest, have a higher level of integrity, this more open kind of corruption is causing problems that are much more dramatic than the problems that would have been caused by the old sort of bad corruption, right? So if a guy gets $50,000 in a brown paper bag, that's one thing. But when we have the kind of corruption in the financial services industry, for example, that led to total deregulation of these new instruments and then blew up the economy as that house of cards began to collapse, the consequences of that corruption are much greater than anything we've seen in the past. So I'm not out here to call individuals evil or to call individuals unethical. I think we got to recognize that there's a difference between the good souls that might be in Congress and the corruption that might influence the whole institution. And it's that institution that is my focus.
Lawrence Lessig, where were you when you heard the Supreme Court hand down its decision to open the floodgates and corporate money in electoral politics, and what was your reaction?
Well, I was in Cambridge. I was sitting at my desk expecting the decision to come down. It came down, and I read it as quickly as I could because I had to go catch an airplane. And so actually, sitting at the airport in San Francisco, I recorded a video to talk to people about how significant this decision was.